Recently, it has been repeated a lot that the German army in World War II was driven by drugs. That drugs, notably an amphetamine called Pervitin, supposedly turned German soldiers into super soldiers. In other words, was the success and endurance of the German soldier in World War II due to widespread drug use? Was that really true? Today we're going to find out that, in fact, the Allies were much more addicted to drugs than the Germans themselves. Before we start this video, I'm going to recommend my book to you, which is already published and for sale. Did you see The Atom as a Weapon? The Atom as a Weapon tells the story of the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bombs during World War II. It's been a few years since the internet, particularly here on YouTube, has been populated by a series of videos that attribute the success of the German soldier in World War II to Pervitin, a variant of amphetamine, right? Actually, a commercial form of amphetamine that was used like this in Germany during the pre-war years, quite particularly among the civilian population. And although the use of Pervitin by the German army was quite widespread, particularly in the first months of the war, and when I say that, I mean that the use of Pervitin reached its peak between April and July of 1940, that is, during the Battle of France. The use of this drug later declined within the German army, particularly from 1942 onwards, when the Third Reich government officially restricted its use due to its high potential for addiction. But the word had already spread and even resulted in movies, right? Like this short film from 2024 called Pervitin with the subtitle The War. It's a bitter pill to swallow. Not only this obscure short film, but also the new Amazon Studios movie, Der Tiger, right? From Germany as well, also in its premise, that those soldiers would be supplied with methamphetamine from Nazi Germany. Very well. So I use this article here as my source. Medical Science and the Military, the Allies' Use of Amphetamines. During World War II, Medical Sciences and the Military, the use of amphetamines by the Allies during World War II, published in 2011 by Professor Nicholas Rasmussen. Nicholas Rasmussen is an American historian who currently works at the University of New South Wales, over in Australia, and he has a very broad line of research on the use of toxic substances, addictive substances, and drug use. How has drug use developed throughout human history? And in 2011, he published this article, which remains quite obscure even today, dissecting the use of amphetamines by the Allies in World War II, especially the British and the Americans. Although this is the most famous version of the drug that we know, Pervitin, which was developed and sold in Nazi Germany and used by the troops in large quantities. In 1940, this other version here, much less known, was used much more. This here is Benzedrine sulfate, in simple terms, amphetamine, which was developed and also sold in the United States during the 1930s. For us to start understanding the story, amphetamine was created in 1929 initially as a medicine for asthma, but in 1932 this laboratory here, SmithKline French, obtained the patent for the substance and began selling it on the market as Benzedrine sulfate tablets. By the mid-1930s, Benzedrine sulfate was prescribed for basically everything, from menstrual cramps to bedwetting. But one very widespread and commonly prescribed use of this drug was to combat depression. Pay attention to this 1945 advertisement sponsored by the SmithKline and French laboratory, the owner of Benzedrine. You can see in the background there's a guy with a depressed face looking completely sad, but it's as if he's just a shadow of the person he becomes later. a happy person, a confident person. So the drug would have made him much healthier, much happier, much more productive. And look at what it says here in the ad. Only in the last decade has a therapeutic weapon been made available, benzedrine sulfate, capable of relieving depression, overcoming chronic fatigue, and breaking the vicious cycle of anhedonia, which is the inability to feel pleasure. But despite this advertising campaign to sell the drug to a very broad audience, medical studies from as early as the 1930s pointed out that amphetamine did relieve depression, but it worsened cases of anxiety. Reports from the industry that promoted the idea that the drug increased a person's intelligence were already contradicted at that time by the American neurologist Abraham Mearson, who published a study saying that amphetamine does not increase a person's intelligence, but it does boost their confidence and initiative. In 1941, when the United States Army was already preparing for possible involvement in World War II, this issue here became part of the highest level discussions. This here was shell shock, a psychiatric problem that afflicted many soldiers. Back in World War I in 1941, the term shell shock was starting to be replaced by war neurosis, and it was clinically described as damage to the soldier's mental organization, making him unable to escape from a threatening situation. The generals knew that casualties from combat fatigue would probably be very numerous, and the Army doctors indicated that adrenaline was a substance that could prevent the soldier from having a nervous breakdown while he was in danger. But while adrenaline really helps the body overcome difficulties, in the short term, in the long run, it ends up causing several after effects to the organism. And the medical understanding at the time was that combat fatigue was precisely related to the physical fatigue of the body due to the very prolonged release of adrenaline. So for that very reason, to fight physical fatigue, they started prescribing amphetamines. And let's remember that due to the extensive use of amphetamines by athletes in the 1930s, the addictive potential of the drug was already known by the early 1940s. But in times of war, the generals decided to ignore these signs, because at the time, several myths were also spread that German military success in 1940 was precisely due to the use of Pervitin, the German amphetamine. And a very good example of this would be the use of Pervitin by Stuka pilots, who would then be able to withstand much more easily the very extreme G-forces they were subjected to during. And then this British doctor comes into play, highlighted here by the red arrow, Dr. Roland Winfield, a doctor from the Royal Air Force. Royal Air Force Winfield decided to study the effects of amphetamines on the behavior of Royal Air Force crews during long-duration missions. So he started flying as an observer on several anti-submarine patrol missions in Sutherland seaplanes, missions that lasted more than 12 hours. By observing how the drugged pilots behaved compared to the non-drugged pilots, Winfield observed that amphetamine caused an obvious effect of apparent well-being, making the soldier start to smile more and have more energy to perform his tasks. Soon after, Winfield also boarded 4 engine bombers from the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, which carried out missions from there. He saw the potential of amphetamine taken to its peak. Winfield describes how, on a particular bombing mission, the sky over the target was overcast and most of the crews simply bombed from inside the clouds, unable to see the target on the ground. But one crew that was under the influence of amphetamines simply dove below the clouds and exposed themselves to all the German anti-aircraft fire, justifying it by saying they had to complete the mission at any cost. On another mission near Paris, he saw a Lancaster crew lower their flight altitude to less than 50 meters, to shoot and destroy a German 88 anti-aircraft gun crew. So in the end, after all these observations, Roland Winfield recommended the camp the use of amphetamines for all British crews in combat on the front line, accepting Winfield's recommendation. The Royal Air Force then, in 1942, made huge purchases of amphetamines to distribute to its airmen, and the instruction issued at the end of that year was that each crew member should take 2 5-milligram tablets, a total of 10 members, before departing for missions. Instruction. Bernard Montgomery, here on the right side of the photograph, was also a strong supporter of the use of amphetamines by the troops. He called amphetamines the confidence drug, against the fear his troops had of Irving Rommel. To prove the effectiveness of amphetamines, Montgomery conducted 2 tests. He sent 2 battalions on a march, one using drugs and the other without drugs, concluding that the battalion that used the drugs reached the finish line faster. And in the second test, he used 2 combat groups in exhausting conditions. 56 hours of firefights, assembling and disassembling machine guns, building trenches, finishing with a 10-kilometer march. He noticed that the troops under the effect of amphetamines arrived 11 minutes before the others, who were not under the influence of drugs, realizing the effect of the drug. After these tests, Montgomery distributed amphetamines on a large scale to his troops in Egypt. And during the Battle of El Alamein, the use of amphetamines by British soldiers in the attack was widespread. And knowing this today, I confess that I understand a little better how those British soldiers faced those attacks on the vast minefields that the Africa Corps had placed in front of El Alamein. And compared to the Royal Air Force's medical recommendation, which had indicated the consumption of 10 milligrams per crew member before the missions in El Alamein, the British Army's Middle East Command recommended the consumption of 20 milligrams per soldier. Before the attack, the consequences of the soldiers' abusive use of these substances would still catch up with many of them. But at the time, their government simply chose not to listen to the indications that this would clearly happen. In the same way, we can also notice clear signs of something that could harm us in the future, like not taking care of our investments. Take a look. Check out the chart to see how its value has gone up since then. In the last decade, Bitcoin has increased in average value by about 70% per year. Meanwhile, our real, in the same period, lost 50% of its capitalization, its purchasing power against the dollar. And look, if you follow daily news about Bitcoin, you'll see that one day it goes up, the next day it goes down, and that's completely normal for a variable income asset. But the important thing is, if you look at the long-term chart, you'll see that its trend really is to keep going up. And now, moving our story to the United States, we have to highlight the personality of this doctor here, Dr. Andrew Ivy, who was considered in the 1940s one of the greatest medical authorities in the country. And in 1941, he conducted a battery of tests on the effectiveness of amphetamines in the professional performance of soldiers' lives. This battery of tests conducted by Ivy involved ground soldiers as well as air crews, and repeatedly the results of all these tests were inconclusive. But then, mysteriously, in July 1942, with the United States already in World War II, Dr. Ivy issued a final report on the potential of amphetamines for military use. And in that report, Ivy recommended the widespread use of Benzedrine for all soldiers, saying that it boosts confidence and raises morale, and saying it enhances. Faced with sleep deprivation and fatigue, also stating that the soldier who uses Benzedrine ignores pain and keeps morale high. It's interesting how the medical use of the term morale, which is essentially a military term, comes at a time when the country was gearing up to become the world's greatest power and a supplier of weapons and troops to the entire world. But even so, Ivy's report in July 1942 marks a rather abrupt change in his behavior. The American armed forces had already conducted their own internal tests and had already decided to purchase Benzedrine for use by the soldiers. And in January 1943, it issued a massive purchase order to the SmithKline and French laboratories. Historians today agree that the most important turning point in history happened in 1942 when the vice president of the SmithKline and French laboratory, Francis Boyer, began a very heavy lobbying effort. Along with this guy here, the United States Undersecretary of War, John McCloy, Boyer wrote to McCloy very emphatically, recommending urgency to the Undersecretary, saying that the British had already been using amphetamines for a long time and that the United States couldn't fall behind under this pressure from the industry. McCloy then orders internal studies to be conducted by the Office of the Surgeon General of the United States Army on the effectiveness of the drug, and these studies come back with inconclusive results. But even so, in September 1942, the SmithKline and French laboratories write again to Undersecretary McCloy, thanking him for the large purchase of Benzedrine. February 1943, the Army then begins distributing kits with 6 5-milligram tablets of benzedrine sulfate to all soldiers. And the command in Washington notifies General Eisenhower in Europe and General MacArthur in the Pacific that they will begin distributing only 100,000 kits per month until domestic production starts to ramp up in the following months. Eisenhower then responds to this notification, demanding 500,000 kits per month in the second half of 1943. All American troops, both in England and in the Mediterranean, are already making extensive use of Benzedrine. And, in fact, it is distributed to flight crews as well. This here is a Benzedrine inhaler to be used during flight again. Knowing that now, that scene from the miniseries Masters of the Air comes back to my mind. On the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, when Bucky holds the plane on the mission, even with the whole crew wounded by anti-aircraft shrapnel. But, in the end, he just wants to complete the mission. We don't have any proof that amphetamines are involved in this case, but anyway, the suspicion remains, and it's a suspicion that just keeps growing. Because a 1944 Army Air Force report already showed that statistically, the troops were using Benzedrine in much higher doses than recommended. And they were also, according to the report itself, using the drug recreationally. Outside of duty, Benzedrine also became available to the Marines in the second half of 1943, and they were already making extensive use of Benzedrine. During the invasion of Tarawa Island in November of that year, a battle that was extremely fierce lasted 4 days, caused thousands of casualties, and wiped out all Japanese resistance on the small atoll. A report from the Marine Corps Command used the following terms: the drug turned soldiers into demons on the battlefield. The result was that, in the last year of the war, the use of Benzedrine on the front lines by both American and British soldiers was extremely widespread. And even the troops who assaulted the beaches of Normandy on D-Day made extensive use of amphetamines. Meanwhile, tests with the drug continued to be conducted in the United States. And the generals came to the conclusion that it really did boost the morale of the troops. At the same time, it didn't diminish their cognitive abilities when it came to performing precision shooting. As long as this kind of scenario kept repeating, people continued to turn a blind eye. As for the abusive use of the substance, even though several internal studies showed inconclusive results regarding the drug's effectiveness. There was no reaction from American military doctors, no protest whatsoever regarding the use of the substance during the conflict. And Benzedrine continued to be produced and purchased in large quantities until May 1945, when the contracts were then terminated. However, in 1950, with the start of the Korean War, the American Army once again resumed the purchase and distribution of Benzedrine, in sharp contrast with Germany's internal policy, which, as I already mentioned, in 1943, officially restricted the distribution of Pervitin to the troops. On the front lines, although the more restricted use did continue until the end of the war, the Allied policy regarding the use of Benzedrine remained quite broad. As shown in this advertisement from October 1944, which reads, "For men in combat when the fighting gets tough to save the lives of men in combat by maintaining their mental efficiency. To overcome the symptoms of fatigue, use benzedrine sulfate tablets, which are available for use by the armed forces. The tablets are recommended for use in combat under strict medical prescription and should only be used on those occasions when combat is prolonged or intense. Without the opportunity for normal rest, they are anticipated. Although this is clearly a tactical use rather than a therapeutic use of benzedrine sulfate, the doctor, we believe, will be interested to know that this clinically established and familiar drug has such a distinct military application. American medical boards only really began to pay attention to reports that did not agree with this kind of scenario in 1945, emphasizing that soldiers' combat errors were not caused by fatigue, but rather by anxiety, a symptom that was proven to be amplified by the use of amphetamines. And today, medical literature makes use of the various memoirs of American soldiers from 1945, where many accounts of violent frenzies are reported by these soldiers who killed indiscriminately, but who also appeared with a stunned look, completely confused when they were in the rear. These same reports from 1945 also already confirmed the first cases of amphetamine addiction, a factor that would also spread through the lives of many of these soldiers after the war. And I'm going to wrap up today's explanation for you here. I'll finish in Professor Rasmussen's own words at the conclusion of his scientific article. Stay with me. The main scientific opinion has always been that amphetamines were not recommended for military use. In the absence of objective evidence of its superiority over caffeine, due to its potential for addiction and side effects. But science eventually gave in to a decision that was obviously made by the military, and economic interests, as well as the evidence, suggest direct political intervention. Like all wars, this one did not belong to the scientists, but to the political generals, and, in America, more than anywhere else, to the businessmen. Now tell me, did you already know about this widespread use of benzedrine by Allied troops in World War II? Let us know in the comments. Before we say goodbye, I'll remind you again that the Atom as a Weapon is on sale. Make sure to get yours. Get yours before the price goes up on Amazon, okay? So, click the link in the description or scan this QR code right here and get your copy so you can learn about this very important chapter that marked the end of World War II exactly 80 years ago. If you like this video, then share it with your friends, but also give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. As always, I'll stop here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.